All right, let's get started. Good morning. Thank you all for joining us for the Aerospace Industries Association's second Aero Insights webinar. We're here today to dissect President Biden's fiscal year 2025 budget request and what it means for the aerospace and defense industry, and how you can expect to see these budgetary dynamics play out in Congress this year. I'm Marta Hernandez, Senior Director of Communications here at AIA. In my past life, I spent 12 years on the Hill, doing communications for both the authorizers in the Senate Armed Services Committee, as well as the House Appropriators. I'm joined by my colleagues, Rich, Jeff, and Katarina, whom I'll let introduce themselves now, starting with Rich.
Hi, good morning. My name is Rich Efford. I've been at AIA for 11 years. And before that, I spent 23 years on the House Appropriations Committee professional staff, where I handled defense appropriations and FAA Coast Guard programs as well. And before that, I was at the U.S. General Accounting Office, where I was a defense auditor. Over to you, Jeff.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Jeff Wilson, Senior Director of Legislative Affairs. I've been with AIA for over 4 years, and prior to that, I spent about a decade on the House side, working as a policy advisor for a member of the House Armed Services Committee. Katarina.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. I'm Katarina. I'm our Director of Leg Affairs here at AIA. I do most of our civil aviation portfolio. I was also on the Hill on the House side doing aviation work before coming to AIA over 3 years ago.
Great. Before we get into the good stuff, I'll go over our format. We're going to talk a bit up top, give you the lay of the land, and then break the budget down for you. But we've reserved the last 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. Please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom as we go along, but we'll be getting to the questions at the end. And you can choose to have your question be anonymous if you'd like. All right, so getting into it, President Biden released his budget just over a month ago on March 11th, but Congress hadn't even finished their work on the current for the current fiscal year yet. The first package of bills, which included funding for the FAA and NASA, was enacted on March 9th. But the second package of bills, including defense funding, wasn't signed into law until March 23rd, which is pretty late, although not unheard of lately. Rich, what can you tell us about where we landed with FY24 appropriations for NASA, the FAA, and DoD? How do these agencies fare in the grand scheme of things?
Well, Marta, last year was one of the most difficult years we've had probably in the last 2 decades. We had shutdown threats. We had, as you said, 6 months of continuing resolutions. We had a budget deal that didn't look like a budget deal, and then in the end, the budget deal prevailed. And so it was a very tough year. The Fiscal Responsibility Act did in the end prevail, the figures that were in there, which provided a little more than a 3% increase for the Department of Defense and about a 2% increase for the non-defense agencies. So even though these agencies were on hold for 6 months, in the end, they got at least somewhat of an increase to accommodate some of the inflation that they're experiencing. So we dodged several bullets, but in the end, Congress did come through 6 months late.
And Jeff, these budget politics will give us great insight into what we can expect for the year ahead. And what do you think that forecasts as we get into the nitty gritty on the 25 budget?
I think if you just look at the spending fight over the past year, it's going to be a lot of the same, honestly. The disagreements haven't gone away. There's a lot of tension as it comes to the procedure and the process in which appropriations is done. On the Republican side, they're very opposed to these last minute large omnibus deals, and they also want to cut spending. And on the Democrat side, it's kind of, they want to increase spending to kind of match with what we want. And so again, you see this tension building, and ultimately we're in a divided government. And so a bipartisan path is going to be the only way forward. And no one's going to get exactly what they want. And as you saw with leadership kind of saying we're sticking to the agreement of the FRA level, that's what we're going to go with. That's where the tension on the Republican side kind of boiled up. And so as you look ahead to this year's spending fight, it's going to be a lot of the same issues. You're going to have folks wanting to cut spending on on both the non-defense and defense side. They're going to want to avoid doing, large packages, which is where we ended up. Really, if you look at it, at the end of the day, we ended up, instead of doing one, we did two. And so I do kind of forecast seeing a lot of the same stuff, CRs in September, and we'll go into more of that a little later, but it does kind of look like we're going to delay everything until after the election.
So, okay, let's dive into those FRA levels. The top line for this budget was just under 1.7 trillion in discretionary budget authority overall. That's 895 in defense spending for both DoD and the nuclear security functions at DOE. That's 37 billion above last year. And then 734 for non-defense discretionary fundings, which is 26 billion below last year. These are not necessarily what President Biden would have chosen if he had his way. So, Jeff, anything you want to shed some light on there about President Biden's view?
On the defense budget?
On FRA broadly, anything?
On FRA, I think a lot of times people have to remember that it wasn't just a budget fight, that we were also dealing with, the debt ceiling, and that this was an issue where, again, Republicans wanted to cut spending, and they wanted a budget that was going to reflect that in order to pass a debt ceiling deal. That was the only way it was going to get across the House, was we have to cut spending or it has to be level in some sense. And so with the FRA, in comes the caps, right? And it was only marginal real increases for both non-defense and defense. And then you had leadership basically saying, we're staying to this agreement that we put in place. This is, we've punted the debt ceiling issue for 2 years, but here are now caps. And that's what we're now seeing, is that, the FY24 approach basically stayed right at the FRA levels, and we can expect that with FY25 as well.
But Rich, President Biden was still able to get some of his priorities in place. What kind of message is he sending with this budget overall?
Well, I think, first of all, the first message is he believes the FRA deal for FY25 is the best that he can get from this Congress. So I see this as a transitional budget, that he's certainly setting some of his priorities in here. For example, he is proposing to restore some of the taxes that were cut back in 2017, about $6 billion of additional tax revenue, and using that to fund about $3 billion of new spending throughout the next 5 years. We don't know. It's pretty unlikely that Congress is going to pass either of those, but this is a message that the president is sending, that the tax debate that we'll talk a little bit more later is important to the president, and he sees that as an important message in this budget to kind of get started on that right now. Even within a 1% budget growth next year, the president is setting some priorities, particularly within the non-defense accounts. You see some agencies did better than others. The FAA did a little bit better than NASA, for example, in the agencies that we follow. So I think those are some of the messages he's sending. He's also sending a positive message about inflation coming down, which essentially means interest rates will come down, and hopefully the federal government will pay less in interest on the debt. So there are a number of things deep in the budget proposal that you can see where the president's going.
Absolutely. Katerina, is there anything else you want to share about the economic circumstances surrounding this budget before we dive into the specific programs that we at AIA here care about?
Yeah, I think kind of what Rich was just touching on with inflation, we keep talking about it over the past couple of years, and it still hasn't gone away. And something that we consistently talk about and advocate for at AIA is, all elements of the top line. So that's investment, predictability, and policy. And so that's not just important for FAA and NASA and DoD, but particularly if we're looking at the defense budget, which I know you'll get into, inflation impacts every element of the budget, from, who's going to be participating in the defense industrial base, and even DoD's purchasing power. So I think, the inconsistent and unpredictable nature of the budgeting and appropriations process the past few years has just added to the vulnerabilities in the supply chain and the economic headwinds we're facing and our competitive advantage, but also, you know, on the national security side of things, which I know you guys will get into here shortly.
Yes, well, great segue there. So as I mentioned, the overall security budget is just under 900 billion. Jeff, what does this top line mean for the Department of Defense?
You know, I think as Katarina just pointed out, you know, the big message here is that the DoD is losing its purchasing power. You know, so it's a 1% increase based off of the FRA. And when you factor in inflation, when you factor in, you know, the increases that are kind of already built into every year when it comes to DoD spending. So you're talking about, you know, the planned pay raises for military and civilian personnel, you know, the increases that'll happen in healthcare. You build all of that into just a 1% increase. You have to start making cuts somewhere. And you saw that with the DoD's budget when you broke it down by the services. A longer list of the, you know, kind of unfunded priorities, you know, cuts to, you know, procurement. And ultimately, you know, in looking at the FY25 request, there was actually less requested for RDT&E and procurement than what was funded under FY24. You know, in particular, RDT&E, you know, account would drop by 3.5%. So, you know, the DoD is kind of having to factor this into how they build out their budget, in that they're going to have less buying power. It's going to have, you know, long-term impacts. This isn't something that we can resolve now over the next, okay, well, let's reset it with FY26 budget. This is going to take years to unpack, and it's going to have impacts on future budgets and future buying power of the DoD.
Are there any other specific areas that A&D companies should be keeping an eye on in terms of areas that, you know, may have received bigger cuts or may have been prioritized a little more in this budget? And is there anything that we might see folks in Congress prioritize improvements to?
I mean, I think you're always going to see Congress go towards plussing, you know, president's budget comes out, the first kind of areas they focus on is procurement and RDT&E. So, you know, this budget was lower than FY24. So you could see at the end of the day, you know, whatever, once we get to whatever the final agreement is, you could see that kind of corrected. That is typically where Congress likes to focus its attention first. But again, you know, we don't know what ultimately will be the final product, but that is, you know, that is typically kind of where Congress focuses their attention.
Marta, let me throw in a couple of points too. The president's budget proposes a split pay raise this year, 4.5% for military and 2% for civilian employees. So the budget assumes that, but Congress has very rarely ever done that. And they're very unlikely to lower the military pay raise. In times past, they've always raised the civilian up to the military. So you add another 2.5% of a pay raise for the civilian workforce in DoD that is not included in the budget. That's going to impact some of their planned activities. The other thing is fuel costs. DoD, not surprisingly, buys a lot of fuel. Anybody that's gone to the pump recently knows that fuel costs are going up. It's not clear exactly how that's going to impact DoD, but things like that have an enormous effect on the operations and maintenance budget of the DoD, that a 1% increase really just doesn't cut it.
Yeah, absolutely. When I was doing communications, the military pay raise was absolutely something that was a easy way to hit it out of the park on the messaging. But it's a statutory thing. They have to not have that go into place. So Congress can't take all the credit for it. So I'm going to go back to Jeff, and that's really helpful context, Rich. But I also want to go back to something Jeff said about the top line and where that's going to go. You already have the four corners of the Armed Services Committee saying they want to plus up this top line, given all the threats we face. This is something they've done and led the way on over the past couple of years. So it absolutely has precedent, and the appropriators have then followed through. How do you think that this 850 top line is going to play out in Congress this year?
Marta, as you mentioned, we've seen this in the past, right? President's budget will come out and immediately, Hask and Sass leadership is like, well, we're going above that. And that number varies, right? It's, anywhere from 20 to 40 billion, kind of depending on what, each committee thinks that they can accomplish. One of the interesting things, though, is that last year there was an attempt to do that, or there was discussion that we saw around this time. Hask was saying they wanted to go above, but ultimately, as we talked about, congressional leadership made it pretty clear we're sticking to the FRA level, and the appropriators followed suit. So that effort to try to increase the DoD number kind of stalled out, particularly in the House. It was like we don't have the support to do this. This year, though, they're already out early messaging on it. So it's really going to come down to, does, like on the House side, does Chairman Rogers have the support to do it in committee? Can he get it done? Can he get that plus up? I think he does have the support to do it, but will the appropriators follow suit? And so that's going to be the interesting thing to watch is, what is the message coming down from congressional leadership, particularly in the House? Is it, look, we're sticking to the FRA level, the appropriators, you need to appropriate to that and kind of ignore if, the Chairman Rogers is successful. And then what happens in the Senate? Does Schumer stick to the level that then, or does he kind of give kind of the green light and allow, Sass to plus up? So this is definitely one of those interesting things to kind of watch unfold is, are the authorizers going to be successful in plussing it up? How much? And then do the appropriators, like you said, typically they're happy to fall in line with that. They always love being able to appropriate more money, but is this going to be a situation where leadership kind of, nixes that idea and we're sticking to the FRA?
Absolutely. Rich, any other insight into how the appropriators might react to this 850 top line?
Well, I think that they, as Jeff said, they'll be looking at the FRA levels and what is coming out of the leadership in the House Budget Committee on the House side. Have a new chairman on the House Appropriations Committee just getting underway this month. I think that we're already seeing the conservatives in the House saying that they don't want to live with the FRA caps. They'd like those numbers to go down more, maybe not on defense, but I think they're sending the message that the budget debate is open, even though the FRA is in place for next year. So I think it's a fair point to have this discussion now about what's really needed within the DoD. And I think that's what the appropriations committees will start working on.
All right, well, let's talk a little bit about some of those naysayers in the House. Obviously, that is the hot topic du jour, what's going on with the speakership, of course, but the instigation for these threats to vacate the speakership with the supplemental plan. Obviously, geopolitical situations are changing and pressing the urgency of the situation. And, we are going to go back and talk about this current fiscal year, but, they're currently trying to figure out this path forward on a $95 billion national security supplemental, or maybe 4 supplementals, or who knows what happens here. Obviously from AIA's perspective, this is a much needed plus up to address these ongoing security challenges. But more critically, it's the majority of this funding stays right here at home. There was this picture of last night circulating Twitter of the speaker's supplemental plan, and it said 60% of this money is going to stay here, backfilling stocks, shoring up the DIB, the defense industrial base, to make sure we have that credible deterrent and that capacity. Jeff and Rich, both of you, can you talk a little bit more about what the supplemental does and the benefits that it provides the DIB? Start with Jeff.
Yeah, as you mentioned, so about 35 of the Senate, let's go off of the Senate, passed supplemental, about 35 billion of that goes directly to the defense industrial base. And that's important because, as you mentioned, it's backfilling what we've already kind of transferred to global threats. And it's also necessary because it will, as you said, it strengthens the defense industrial base, particularly the supply chain. They need this, and that cash will flow down, and it kind of puts us on the right track. And so we are strongly supportive of it. We hope whatever path forward ultimately, includes direct funding for the defense industrial base. And so, we are certainly going to be watching what the House does this week and see what they can get over to the Senate.
Yeah, I would just add that, as Jeff said, we depleted our munition stocks and other capabilities pretty significantly, and the Department of Defense needs to restore those. This is not just about the security of Ukraine and Israel and Taiwan. This is about the security of the United States as well.
Great, possible. All right. Well, let's move on to another topic that's been in the headlines a little bit lately, and that is civil aviation. The FAA, let's start by saying, remains the gold standard in aviation safety, innovation, efficiency, but it does take investment to keep it that way. At the same time, we're asking FAA to coordinate all these new innovations like advanced air mobility, commercial space, and to do that, the president's budget asks for just a total of just over 21 billion to do all that and more. So, Katerina, what can you tell us about this budget request?
Yeah, thanks, Marta. So I can kind of start with breaking down that FAA request a little bit and how it kind of aligns with our AIA priorities. So when we're looking at the operations account, that's going to receive a 6.9% increase overall. And within operations, that's also where the aviation safety office is held. So looking at aviation safety specifically, it gets a little less of an increase at 5%. Facilities and equipment will also see an increase of 12.8%. And then looking at research, engineering, and development, they are down a little bit. But overall, in the context of what Rich and Jeff were discussing, with the tight budget, with only a 1% increase, FAA has fared fairly well in this PBR request. Obviously, like you said, there are safety challenges. We do need adequate resources to address that. And at the same time, as you mentioned, we're in this renaissance kind of period, if you will, of aviation. You have all these new technologies trying to come to market. Advanced air mobility, supersonic is trying to come back, sustainability initiatives. So we need the FAA to have the resources it needs to not just be able to certify aircraft as they've traditionally done, but also the resources they need to keep up with the industry and all the innovations that we're looking at.
Great high level overview there. Are there any other specific AIA priorities that you want to highlight in the FAA? The clean.
Yeah, sure. So, obviously, like I said, there's even within civil aviation, we have a broad kind of swath of the industry. So not just the traditional airframers, the engine makers, AAM, etc. But what we really look at in our priorities is what's going to move the industry forward as a whole. So policies and programs at the FAA that stand to benefit all of civil aviation. So you mentioned clean. That's always going to be one of our top priorities for appropriations each year. It's a successful industry cost share program, clearly demonstrates the new sustainability technologies that we on the industry side are putting money into and continuing to invest in and make more successful for the future. A couple other priorities I'd highlight, one other issue that you folks might recall that bubbled up in early 2022 was the whole 5G radio altimeter issue. So as new 5G towers were coming online, they were potentially going to interfere with critical aviation safety equipment, which is the radio altimeter. So the appropriators did add in some money for research and development last year, and we're hoping to see that again this year as we kind of work towards this new standard and a deadline coming up in 4 years here. So something we definitely don't want the appropriators to forget about. And then one other thing I'll touch on is just, in 2020, the AXA legislation passed, and that created a lot of new requirements on the FAA. So in this PBR, there is explicit, request for things like getting more funding for human factors experts. And that's something that we're really tracking closely. We want to make sure that the FAA has what it needs, as I mentioned, to certify aircraft as safely as possible, as they have always done, and also in an efficient manner. So they're even looking at things now like a work tracking system where even applicants, and this is really important for new entrants, can go in, track where they are in the certification process, kind of eliminate, always having to exchange physical paper documents, moving on to kind of computer model-based systems engineering. So we're really excited that the FAA is taking a look at a lot of these kind of steps that match safety and innovation, make sure we're on the right foot going forward.
Great. Thanks for that. Rich, do you want to talk a little bit about the FAA's space budget and what they're doing there?
Sure. The FAA has the ability to kind of hold back industry because they regulate the safety not only of air travel, but also of commercial space launches. And that's an important function, but that means it's important to fund the FAA enough so that they're not holding the industry back. The president's budget for this year proposes a significant increase in FAA's office that regulates and licenses commercial space launches. Commercial space launches went from 31 in 2018 to 79, I believe, last year. That is just typical of the increase that you're seeing in this industry, rapidly expanding, partly because of technologies like 3D printing and reusable rockets, and a number of other things that are lowering the cost for companies to invest and get involved in commercial space. FAA needs to respond to that. This budget request would take that office from 42 million to 57 million, which is a significant increase, about 55 additional staff years to speed up and accelerate and support the industry. So we're very pleased to see that. We think it's important for Congress to approve that request.
Great. So let's look forward now. Let's you look at our crystal ball. How do we think that these requests shake out in Congress? What do you see for the future, given that there is bipartisan support for the FAA?
Yeah, I can start. I think we're very hopeful that the FAA will fare well, despite kind of the prediction Jeff gave of complications of it being an election year and waiting till after to finish appropriations, which is not obviously something we want to see. But given the safety challenges that everyone is reading about, we don't anticipate anyone wanting to cut the FAA. We're looking forward to the new chair of the House subcommittee, Steve Womack. We think he has a good history of bipartisanship and will lead that subcommittee well. So, Rich, do you have any other thoughts about that?
I guess I would add that the FAA is one of those agencies that provides day-to-day essential services to the American public. They provide air traffic control, commercial airplanes, general aviation airplanes. They provide safety oversight of not only airplanes, but also pilot training and airline operations. So I think Congress realizes this, and also the airlines and the general aviation users are paying into a trust fund to finance those activities of the FAA. I think Congress recognizes this, that they're a little different than many of the other agencies with these kind of services. So I think that we'll get pretty good support from the Congress, at least looking back over the last few years, they have tended to do that. And a lot of these increases are either to address air traffic control, safety issues, or to address other issues that in many cases Congress has mandated. So we're cautiously optimistic.
That's a good sign. So I'm going to pull back onto space again, and let's go hop over to the Commerce, Justice, Science bill and talk about the NASA budget. The president requested 25.4 billion for FY25, which is above the levels that were enacted in 24, but the same as 23. So for those who might have missed our great budget webinar on this a couple of weeks ago, Jeff, can you provide a little more information on what our views on that budget?
Yeah, I think, one of the examples we've been using is that the NASA budget kind of went from green light, yellow to red. And so, to kind of summarize that, it's, last year, for the first time in 10 years, the appropriations package actually cut funding to NASA. We did see kind of a course correction with the president's budget. It does support an increase for FY25, but this is kind of, an alarm sign that's kind of being thrown up, and that, Congress is maybe not viewing NASA and its priorities as much as they used to. So certainly we're going to continue to advocate, with all of the new attention, all of the focus, all of the activities that are happening in space, NASA needs an adequate budget, one where it can carry out all of these missions. And so it is one that we're seeing that trend where the budget is kind of starting to decrease, when we've been hopeful that it could be kind of getting, marginal increases each year.
Great. And then Rich, you want to dive into any of the specifics of this budget request?
Sure. Well, first let me add, I went through the Commerce, Justice, Science conference report for FY24, thinking that maybe some agencies fared better than NASA. And it really wasn't the case. It was pretty balanced. All of those agencies, including the Justice Department and NIST and the research programs, they were all either flat or cut back some. And so I think would be hopeful that they could get a little higher allocation this year, so that there'd be more for not only NASA, but some of the other things in that portfolio. In the request, most of the activities are either level funded or slightly decreased. Aeronautics is a pleasant change from that. They have a slight increase. They have about a 3% increase, and we're glad to see a priority on that, because that's very important to our industry. But many of the larger programs that we've heard about, like Orion or the Space Launch System, the deep space exploration programs, those are being cut back. When you look through the NASA list of programs, they're either flat, or almost all of them flat, or slightly decreased. So I think we're hopeful that with this increase, that Congress will look at that and not go back to the FY23 or do more than the FY23 level for NASA, so they can give them some increase, because all these programs are level funded. And as you know, NASA efforts are very complex, multi-year efforts, not unlike some of the things that we see in the Department of Defense. And to be on a yo-yo budget going up and down makes it very difficult for them to really achieve their missions.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I appreciate you all providing those high-level summaries. And, for folks, if you have questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat. But before we kind of look at the broader path forward, I want to talk about the other side of the budget, the tax side. We don't always talk about that as much when, we're thinking through the budget, whether that's here at AIA or, for Rich and myself as former appropriators. But, the tax part of this budget is a big part of what President Biden is trying to achieve, to try to, tout his cuts to deficit. And we have a big year coming up in terms of tax expirations. So, Rich, you talked a little bit about taxes up top, but anything else you want to add right now?
Yeah, let me just say that this should be on everybody's radar screen for next year. The new president takes office in January of 2025. That is the same month that the debt ceiling expires. Now they have what's called extraordinary measures that the Treasury can take to extend the debt ceiling. So That may not get us to a fiscal cliff until the spring, maybe the second quarter of next year. But at the same time, the new president or the existing president in his second term will have to face the expiration of a lot of the tax cuts that were in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. All of the individual tax cuts, the cuts for individuals, expire at the end of tax year 2025. The Internal Revenue Service needs some time. So Congress can't do what they do with the appropriations process and wait till the last minute or go overtime. When they do that, the Internal Revenue Service can't send withholding guidance out to employers because they don't know what to send. And everything gets pretty chaotic at that point. So the president, working with the Congress, will have a debt limit conversation in the first and second quarter of next year. And at the same time, they really have to get serious about how they're going to approach these expiring individual taxes. The current president, obviously, from his budget request, is proposing some increases in the corporate tax. So putting back some of the corporate taxes to help finance the continuation of the individual taxes. So he's staking out his position early. Republicans will obviously have their position as well, but this will be a pretty significant fight in 2025.
Something for us to look forward to, I guess. Who wants to be president? So I'm going to go and have Katerina go a little bit more into specifics on one tax provision that we care a lot about here at AIA, and that is the R&D tax expensing policy. Katerina, what can you share about that?
Yeah, so I mean, another tax day filing deadline has come and gone, and unfortunately, we haven't seen any relief. Our members, but more specifically, the small businesses that are members of AIA and that comprise our supply chain are disproportionately affected by the R&D amortization requirements. So we're certainly very supportive of the Smith-Wyden deal and the inclusion of the 4-year retroactive delay. Obviously there would need to be more permanent action, and we'll keep advocating for that. And so I think, we're going to keep pushing on certainly Senate Republicans that this really does matter, because like I said, small businesses, if their tax bill is even up, $100,000, that really does matter. That impacts their workforce, that impacts, their ability to comply with different federal requirements like the CMMC, or even, just leaving the defense industrial base if we're looking at it from the DoD point of view. So, from our perspective, this legislation really does matter. We don't want to see a time, come and go where they say it's too late. It still is very important for our member companies.
Absolutely. And it sounds like, that today there was some encouraging news at a punch bowl that we have, some additional senators. We know Senator Young has been a champion of this. He introduced the first bill to address this back in last spring. And now we have Senators Sinema and Hawley joining him. So still some efforts going on behind the scenes, and we'll remain optimistic and hopeful there, given how important this is to so many aerospace and defense companies. So, with our last few minutes, let's look at the path ahead. The Senate and the House are working through their annual budget hearings now through each subcommittee. You've got DoD and NASA tomorrow in the House. We're expecting subcommittee markups and full committee markups in May, June, July timeframe. As Rich mentioned earlier, over in the House, we have a brand new chairman of the Appropriations Committee, Tom Cole from Oklahoma, who is a defense hawk, who is a long-term appropriator, who really gets the dynamics of what's going on. And, I think he's a great choice to take the reins from the first Republican woman chair, Kate Granger, who opted to take a step back before she retires from Congress at the end of the year, and who is also a great champion for our industry. I think One thing to note about Tom Cole is he's a realist. He understands what he's up against, and he's not afraid to talk about it. So I'm sure our friends in the media are excited to have him up top there. I think one story that kind of illustrates, his perspective on things is that in November of last year, when he was Cardinal of the Transportation Subcommittee, he told Politico that he has 8 to 10 people who are upset that Amtrak is being cut, and then the same amount of people who want to see Amtrak eliminated altogether. And he needs both of those people to vote for a bill, the bill that he needs to get passed. And that's the kind of political dynamic that he's going to be dealing with as chair writ large. So, he's going to work with his counterparts in the Senate, Senator Murray and Senator Collins, his counterpart in the House, Rosa DeLauro, Congresswoman DeLauro. And, they got that deadline of September 30th that we so often almost always don't make. So, all right, I'll start with Jeff, but this is really for everyone. So what do you think? What can we expect in the months ahead in an election year?
Yeah, I think you have to first kind of look back at what Congress has been doing the past, really, decade as it relates to the spending deals. As you mentioned, we'll see the committee do its work. They'll do the budget hearings, which will follow subcommittee marks and full committee marks. And we expect both the House and the Senate to complete that process. Where things have gotten trickier, though, is on the House side. Usually the House has been pretty good about dedicating floor time to at least attempt to accomplish all 12 spending bills, either individually or, packaged, depending kind of, again, on what leadership wants to do. But what you saw last year was they weren't, there was a big effort by leadership to, look, we're going to do all 12, we're going to do them, individually. And they got kind of halfway through that and, started slowly losing votes as each bill comes, because it gets difficult, right? DOD's usually an easier bill to pass on the House floor as an individual, but the other ones are trickier. And so I think as you look to this year, I will certainly be interested to see, can the House bring some of these bills to the floor, dedicate, time, allow amendments, and ultimately get it across? Because the other thing is they're going to add in all of the policy writers. So it's going to lose that kind of bipartisan votes real quickly. And so it's going to take the House Republicans passing it with House Republican support. And that's, again, where they kind of fell into the trap last year and were unable to complete the process. So I think ultimately, and I don't think this surprises many, that, we'll probably see a CR in September that likely brings us to pass the election late November, early December. And that's really where, the debate will begin, certainly based off of what happened in the election, who has control of the House, who has control of the Senate, who has control of the White House in next year.
CRs seem to be, a necessary evil, and obviously top choices to avoid those, given if the instability, the uncertainty, the no new starts, those no advancements. Rich, can you talk a little bit more about why CRs are just so bad for the country, but also really the aerospace and defense industry in particular?
Yeah, I think what's particularly depressing is that we've had CRs, they've become a way of life, it seems like. But agencies are used to accommodating a month or two, maybe, even into early December. And it's disruptive, but we've done that every year. What you're seeing in the last few years now is that what became 2 or 3 months worth of CRs is now becoming 4 to 6 months. And you're going half a year where agencies can't start programs. The DoD can't do any production increases in addition to the new starts. Many of the agencies can't participate in hiring, so they have hiring freezes. They'll cut back travel, and they go for half a year at this. It's disruptive to them. It's very disruptive to their industry partners. How can you hire suppliers if for a month at a time? You can't do that. So everything essentially is on hold. And now we're going half a year and then sort of boom or bust spending through the other half of the year. It's not surprising that agencies really aren't doing as well as they should, because they're not getting their money on any kind of reliable basis. Secretary of the Air Force Frank Kendall said the other day that in the last 15 years, if I remember right, that the Air Force had lost 5 years of modernization lead time, meaning that that was about what they were under CRs for, about a third of the time. And when you think about how complex some of these efforts are, that's really devastating for our industry, for space systems, for military weapon systems, and also for agencies like the FAA.
Absolutely. That is a stark statistic from Secretary Kendall there. We have another kind of threat on the funding horizon, and that's the continuing threat of automatic spending cuts that will go into place if appropriations are not passed. Jeff, you want to share a little bit about that, please?
Yeah, I'll touch on that. Real quick, I wanted to go back to, one of the points on the CR is, as Rich mentioned, no new starts. So for the new programs that are about to get funded finally, that funding, the flow of the cash down to the supplier base, to your small companies, is still another 4 or 5 months out. So it's a whole, that's where the impact really is felt on the small companies, is that by the time that the program funding gets to the OEM, then it gets from the OEM down to the supplier, that doesn't happen in days or weeks. It takes months. And so your supplier base is just sitting there waiting and waiting and waiting. It'll be basically a year before they actually see funding for the new programs that they have been contracted to work on. And then getting to the automatic spending cuts, we've seen this anytime there has to be a debate about the Budget Control Act, which created sequestration, and it was we're never going to let sequestration happen. We'll come to a grand deal, super committees, all of that. Congress is kind of bringing this back as a motivation tactic of, if you don't get this done, here comes with what we saw in last year's FRA, there's going to be that 1% cut if you don't do your job. And it's actually kind of turned on it, because you then have now members of Congress saying, let's hit the 1% cut. And they don't necessarily understand that, again, that 1% cut isn't going to just be across the board. It will impact some programs, some accounts, up to 10%, because you have to factor in what's mandatory spending, what has to be allocated, can't take cuts. And so it's one of those where it's kind of just arbitrary. It doesn't really work as a motivation factor. And so, we will continue to always advocate that shouldn't be a part of any spending deal or any type of budget deal.
Thanks for that. Katerina, anything else you want to add on either CRs or automatic spending cuts from?
I mean, I completely agree with what's already been said. I think, we're on the path, unfortunately, for more CRs this year. As Jeff said, we at AI have a repository of kind of one-page fact sheets. We're going to keep educating Hill staff and members about the impact to the industry, and just kind of hope, as Rich says, that this way of life mentality starts to really chip away, because it's really detrimental.
Absolutely. And obviously, as Jeff mentioned up top, this gets enormously harder in a presidential year. You obviously see this happening all the time with lame duck Congresses getting little done after a certain point, whether that's the August recess or, when they leave in October for 6 to 8 weeks or more. But this means we have a new dynamic in coming months, not just from the election itself, but the result of that. And just to look a little bit farther down the road, Jeff, what do you have to share about your crystal ball predictions about what we can see after the presidential election?
Yeah, I mean, there's, various scenarios that could play out. If it stays a divided government, but then, the administration flips, or, just the Senate, if you stay in that divided government, it's likely going to be a lot of what we see now, but that could impact what gets done in the lame duck. New administration, they may push to say, let's wait until, I'm the president. I want to have that control of the budget. If it's a sweep, again, it would be a scenario where, the Republicans or the Democrats may kind of hold the line and say, let's wait until, we have full control. And what you could expect is, under a Republican control, and what we've at least seen in the past is, adequate increases to defense spending, but sweeping cuts across the board for non-defense. And with the Democrat side, if they were to sweep and take full control, you would probably see again what we've seen in previous kind of scenarios like that, where it would be, increases to non-defense and, again, maybe smaller increases to the defense side. So it really kind of, I think Congress even acknowledges this, that they're going to kind of wait and see what is the result of the election, and then both parties will kind of decide from there what actions do they want to take. Is it, all right, fine, we'll do a large omnibus, or is it kind of, let's do, here we go, we're going to do some more CRs, and as Rich mentioned, maybe then the spending gets wrapped up into the debt ceiling and the taxes. There's so many factors on the horizon that the election is going to play a vital role in kind of what steps Congress takes in those last 2 months of the year.
Absolutely. Rich, anything to add there?
I would just add, Marta, that there's a difference between control and governing control, meaning that, so the House has a control now. The Republicans control the House, but by a couple of votes. So in the Senate, the Democrats have control by 2 votes if you count the vice president. So they have to be very, very cautious in how they move because they can't really lose too many votes on their side. If you have governing control, you have enough of a control that you can lose a few of those members, and then you can actually pass an agenda. And so I think a lot of the members that say we're in control now are not facing the reality that maybe they don't have a governing control and that they have to compromise. So there's that as well.
Absolutely. It does seem like lately compromise has become more of a dirty word, and that's just not the nature of appropriations game, as they always say. There's 3 parties: the Democrats, Republicans, and appropriators. So, any last words on that before from anyone on the panel before we go to questions? All right. Well, we'll just, again, if you have questions, feel free to throw them in. They're anonymous, so don't worry about any attribution or anything there. But I think just to get started with one is Eric, our CEO, has often said that, it takes about 3 years for a budget to be developed. So last year was really the first year that President Biden really had any meaningful, or not meaningful, but had the budget he really may have more wanted. And then now this year we've got this new budget, and there is so much going on in the world that is different. We're 2 years into Ukraine. We've got a hot conflict in the Middle East. Things are getting worse in the Indo-Pacific. How much are the current geopolitical factors affected? Have they shaped this budget, Jeff?
Well, I mean, I think the challenge though is you have to then factor in on, living under the FRA. And so, the president's budget certainly reflects those priorities and as best it can. But as we mentioned at the very top, it has also reflected that he has less buying power. And as you mentioned, as our CEOs talked about, they're already crafting FY26. And what you could see in an FY26 budget is, again, the ripple effects of this, is that the buying power is going to continue to decrease. And it's really going to force the DoD to have to start making real priorities of, what do we need immediately and what can we put on hold in terms of kind of a long-term, we got to put a project on hold because it's just not something that we can fund at this time. And they're going to have to start making those tough decisions.
Great. Awesome. Thank you. All right. We have another question. What are AIA's legislative priorities for the FY25 budget, particularly on the defense side? And are there particular policies, legislative proposals, or reforms that we'll be seeking in the NDAA this year?
I'll tackle NDAA, and then I'll let Rich or Katarina do the budget. On the NDAA, we continue to advocate and push for proposals that will streamline acquisition and procurement reform, whether that's, on commercial acquisition or in your kind of traditional FAR 15, process. And so we're always trying to find ways to kind of play around the edges of contracting and what can we do that can make minor adjustments or changes that would actually help the process move faster. You hear this talked about all the time at congressional hearings or from the DoD or from industry that, we need to be able to move faster to provide for the warfighter. But unfortunately, the regulations only continue to grow. And so we just continue to advocate and offer proposals that will just slowly try to reduce some of that down and bring it to a faster process as a whole.
On the budget side, Marta, I guess I would say that DoD in particular needs a budget that is driven by its needs, and the needs are driven by its threats and its challenges. We don't see that those needs and challenges can be met by a 1% budget increase when a lot of the fundamental elements of that budget are going up 4, 5, 6, 10%. So I think we're hopeful that Congress will recognize that as they go through these hearings, and they'll see that that really this should be more of a demand-driven budget, and also to deal with the supplemental needs. Fortunately, they can address that outside of the caps, outside of the FRE caps as emergency spending. We think that's appropriate. We already hear some conversations about, well, those funds should be offset or they should be loans and paid back. And I think we feel like these are emergencies. These are our commitments to our allies. They should be treated as such.
Absolutely. Anything else to add, Katerina?
I mean, the question wasn't geared towards civil, but on those specific requests, like I kind of touched on at the outset, and same for NASA, there's a lot of programs within both of those agencies and that benefit the whole industry and have, ability for our members to apply to and what have you. So in the next week, we're going to be releasing our CJS and our THUD priorities, and sending those to the appropriators, and those will be public as well.
Yeah. Well, thanks for pointing that out. I was gonna share here that we expect to be putting those out publicly in the next week or so. So stay tuned for those and other of our priorities about how this budget process will affect the industry. Before I wrap up, anything else that our panelists want to share? All
Yeah,
right.
let me throw one quick,
go ahead.
let me throw one quick thing out there before you close. I think the Congress, I think we all feel like the Congress should recognize that the deficit is a problem, but you can't fundamentally address the deficit by attacking the 27% of the budget that's the discretionary budget. So all the conversation in the Congress is about the defense budget or the FAA budget or NASA budget or so forth. That's a little more than a quarter of the overall budget. So if they're going to be real about addressing the deficit problem, then they have to take a broader approach.
Great, thanks. That is a really important point, I think we all agree with here. All right, well, thank you so much to Jeff, Katerina, and Rich, and thank you all for joining us. If you did like this, I encourage you to join AIA's team next Wednesday at 2 p.m. for a deep dive into the National Security Space budget, led by our Senior Director of National Security Space, Steve Jordan Tomaszewski. We're going to put a registration link in the chat now. And if you found this webinar helpful and would like to share it with your colleagues or your friends or family, a recording of this webinar will be available on our YouTube page, and we'll send that around to everyone as well. So thank you all for joining us for this Aero Insights webinar, and we'll see you soon. Thanks. Have a good day.